That's the one you want to do. Definitely not on the computer.
Peter, I don't know if you know this, there was a second lost Sherlock Holmes film found about 3 years ago. This was a German film made in 1929 called The Hound of the Baskervilles. And again, very colorful story. A Czech print was found in the basement of a Polish priest's cache of films. I'll just leave it at that. But until a few years ago, thought to be lost.
Well, Glenn, may I be at liberty to ask you to share with us a couple of the paintings in your collection, perhaps? Just
sure. I have a fair number of illustrations. I'm assuming. I assume safely that this is a Sherlockian crowd. And the first and most famous of the illustrators was a fellow named Sidney Paget. And he did all the illustrations for it, and not the very first, not Study in Scarlet, but all the other short stories up to his death in about 1904. There are 30 extant original illustrations from the Sherlock Holmes stories, and I have 8 of them. Including the Hound and the Priory School. The other very well-known illustrator was an American illustrator called Frederick Dorr Steele, and he was very successful in the early magazine days. But illustrators went out of fashion, and he had a pretty hard life starting in 1930. But a lot of the images that are in your head about Sherlock Holmes are due to him. And I have a goodly number of the original artwork, including the only complete set for one of the short stories. The story of Wisteria Lodge had 9 illustrations by Steele, and I have all 9 of them. So those are a couple of examples.
thank you, Glenn. I'm just admitting folks into the room here, so forgive me if my eyes turn away from the camera. I want to welcome everyone here. So glad to see you. And why don't I do this? While I'm sort of admitting folks as they come in, I'll invite my colleague Callum Cunningham to say a few words.
Thanks, Peter. When Glenn mentioned the Hound of the Baskervilles there, I had these pictures of Basil Rathbone suddenly pop into my head. I remember seeing that movie when I must have been only like 10 or 11. And as soon as the word Sherlock Holmes comes into my mind, that picture, that image of Basil Rathbone shows up. He's just the archetypal image of him for me. But anyway, I wanted to take a few minutes or a moment to share a couple of comments about Peter and introduce Peter, our host today. My name's Callum Cunningham. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Silicon Private Wealth. It's a registered investment advisory firm that's located here in the Silicon Valley. We're a fiduciary and manage portfolios on behalf of our high net worth clients. As you can tell from my accent, though, I just like Sir Arthur, I do come from Scotland, although he was born on the Edinburgh side, and I'm much more on the less sophisticated West Coast side of Glasgow, but still very proud of the fact that a Scotsman has crafted such a cultural stamp that it just, I mean, it's a global recognition of just an amazing piece of work. So very proud of that, proud that he was a Scotsman.
You don't sound much like a Glaswegian to me. I can understand you.
It's funny you should say that, because I was talking to Steve. He's got an interesting accent himself, and the objective of speaking is communication. And I've been here in the US for well over 30 years and traveled globally. in Asia. And the bottom line is you have to get your message across. So that can sometimes take the hard edge off of a heavy Glaswegian accent. And I'm proof of that. And actually, Peter's second oldest daughter, I think, just graduated from University of Glasgow, my alma mater, with a Master of Science. So we're all doing our part. I'm sure that everybody on the call knows Peter personally, probably through his writing. He's a published author and a poet. He's been involved in David Markham's popular Emecz series of Sherlock Holmes short stories, and that was published by Steve, who's going to be presenting to us today. But I know him in his day job. And he is a managing director with us at Silicon Private Wealth, where the mysteries are a little bit more mundane, but we're no less passionate about solving problems for our clients. Peter's definitely part of the team. You know, he's well educated. He has a law degree from Santa Clara here in the Valley, and he has a Master's of Science degree from MIT. And he's also a certified financial planner. And in our business, that's really considered the gold standard in terms of training for the financial services industry. And his family, actually, just to segue, has a long history in the Bay Area. In fact, his family owned a lot of land, or ranching land, and well before Silicon Valley was known for making semiconductors or software. And even before the peach orchards and apricots, cattle was the currency. And his family has a long history here in the Valley. In fact, they were, I guess you could say, very charitable minded, and a large part of the Henry Coe Park, which is the largest state park in Northern California. It's some 87,000 acres of rolling hills, beautiful landscape in the southern part of the Bay Area, was donated by his family. So he's got a long tradition here in the Bay Area, and it's just amazing guy to have as a colleague. Just I can't say enough about him, just as a ethical, collegial, hardworking guy. And, you know, we appreciate his efforts to provide our clients and friends with these deep thinking insights. We've had a number of very interesting webinars. We've had a former deputy director of NSA talk to us about cybersecurity. We've had a talk from a US Navy admiral, you know, tax policy experts and economists. And today we're going to be treated to a presentation from Steve about Sherlock. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Peter, and maybe we can get started.
Thank you so much, Callum. Really appreciate your introduction, your kind remarks. Also, it's a privilege working with you and Pat and others at the firm. I will say that whenever I have any bad news, I love Callum to make the call, because he could tell you bad news, but he has such a great lilting tone that it's always soothing. So, but luckily we don't have much of that to date. So it's just a real pleasure to introduce all the way from London, Steve Emecz. He's by day, he's the director of enterprise sales at Tungsten Network. That firm enables its customers to maximize the value of the invoice process through its digital network of buyers, suppliers, and other business ecosystems, creating the foundation for achieving world-class performance in finance. By night, of course, and weekends, he's the preeminent publisher of Sherlock-related books, and he's going to share with us more about that. Also, before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank James Matthews, the sculptor who granted me permission to take a photo and manipulate the image a little bit of a bust that he did of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And in my effort to support the economy of Britain, I purchased one of his busts, and it's up on my bookshelf here. So, Steve, without further ado, you're kind of the man of the hour here. Also, our call will be recorded. So if you could, once I turn that off, you can use whatever profanities you wish. But while we're recorded, be on your best behavior. And Steve, why don't I just ask you to give us a backgrounder about yourself and how you got started publishing Sherlock Holmes related literature, etc.
Thank you, Peter. I'm not sure how I follow a director of the NSA and an admiral as a guest on your program. Thank you very much for having me on board. But by day, I work in technology. So I've worked in technology for about 30 years. I started my career at Xerox. So many of you guys will know that big tech organization. And in the late 90s, I was exposed to a wonderful new technology called print on demand. It wasn't called that back then, but it was the concept that you could create a book from scratch and create a book on demand rather than print thousands of them and put them in a warehouse and have to pulp a lot of them. So I actually saw the very first books coming off of these big printer production lines. And I thought, right, that's the future of publishing. That's what publishing is going to be. And in about the year 2000, I set up Emecz Publishing as a publishing company. But it wasn't really until about 2006 that when I founded the actual company to publish a book for children with learning difficulties. And that's what started us off. It became a big bestseller. It was in the field of neurolinguistics. But in 2008, I was approached by a historian called Alistair Duncan, who had a very interesting book about Sherlock Holmes. And I'd been a Sherlock Holmes fan, not as deep as Glenn, definitely not as expert as that, but definitely a fan of Sherlock Holmes. And when he approached me with this project, I thought that sounds interesting. And we published the book, and I've got a copy of it here. And it's got the wonderful title of "Eliminate the Impossible." And as you know, that's a great quote from Sherlock Holmes. But what Alistair had done was there were very few reviews of the Conan Doyle stories that were, how can I put this delicately, actually accurate, because generally Sherlockian historians looked at Conan Doyle's work very much with rose-tinted spectacles. So, Conan Doyle's stories would vary from good to excellent, when in fact there are a few howlers inside the Conan Doyle canon. So what Alistair had done is he'd written a very honest précis of all of the stories, so the 56 short stories and the 4 novellas, and it was incredibly well received. And we had a lot of fun publishing it, and we continued from there. And if you fast forward 13 years later, we now have about 500 Sherlock Holmes books and loads of projects. So as I knew this was a video interview, I've got a ton of props here, Peter. So I hope you don't mind. I've got, as you ask me questions, I'll be bringing the props out. But this is the very first one we ever did by Alistair, and he's gone on to do 3 Conan Doyle biographies, one of which won the Sherlock Holmes Book of the Year award, which is called The Norwood Author. Interesting parallel with what we were talking about earlier with Glenn. Alistair found several facts. One of the reasons he won the award, he found several facts about Conan Doyle that nobody had ever discovered. And he did that in research into the 4 years that Conan Doyle lived in Norwood in London.
Bravo. Well, I've got a few of your Emecz series, the ones that somehow they made an error and put one of my pastiches in. So I think I've been in, maybe had 7 stories included, and it's just been so much fun. Could you speak a little bit to your connections with in talks at Sherlock Holmes related clubs around the world? I'm a bit cloistered, but in your travels, have you rubbed elbows with different Sherlock related clubs?
I have done. I've done a few interesting talks. I think probably the most interesting one was that I actually flew over to Germany to a place called Karlsruhe, and I did a talk on Sherlock Holmes to the European school there. But I've been to a number of the societies. This year it's been quite interesting because I've been able to participate in the Bsi Weekend. So the Baker Street Irregulars is one of the most renowned societies based in the US, and they have a whole weekend of shenanigans that go on in January called the Bsi Weekend. And I've never been able to go to the Bsi Weekend because, as we'll probably talk a little bit about later, I'm usually the early part of January, I'm usually in Africa. So I've never been able to go to that in person. But this year, because of the pandemic, we've not been able to travel, and they did the Bsi Weekend virtually for the first time. I also went to the Sherlock Holmes Society of London annual general meeting this year, again, virtually. That's also in January. And it was quite interesting to participate with lots of Sherlockians, many of whom were dressed in black tie, which is kind of bizarre as you're doing it from home. But I did it. I dressed up in my tuxedo, and we all participated and doing the toasts, standing up and having a drink, and all that sort of stuff with hundreds of people online. So I would say that the societies have grown quite significantly under the pandemic, I think, in a kind of virtual participation way.
One thing that I note, Steve, in the Emecz series which are edited by David Markham, and David asked that we be sure and record this. He is having to work today. But one of the things that I note is that proceeds go to Undershaw, which you mentioned earlier, that your involvement with neurodiversity, and I think that's part of the focus of the tenant of the Undershaw estate. But could you talk just a little bit about that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle estate and your involvement in supporting their efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're referring to is a project which was the brainchild of Sherlock Holmes author called David Markham. He's based out in the US. And about 5 years ago, he woke up one morning and decided that he wanted to bring back more traditional Sherlock Holmes. So this was shortly after the time of BBC Sherlock and Robert Downey Jr. in the Sherlock Holmes movies. So there was a lot of modern adaptations, and he felt that we needed to go back to the original stories and have stories written in that way. So he got in contact with me and he said, Steve, I'd love to do a collection. I'd like to break the world record, which was set at 26 at the time, of new Sherlock Holmes stories in one anthology. So he said, I'm going to try and get to maybe something like 30 stories. And I'm going to reach out to writers all over the world with a very, very clear premise, which is I want a very traditional story. Holmes and Watson in the Victorian era, deducing and solving crimes, no phantoms or no time travel or none of these things. What I want is traditional stories. And what do you think? Would you do this? It would be lovely to raise some funds, get all of the authors to donate their royalties to the Undershaw Preservation Trust. So I said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. He reached out to writers all over the world, and it started to snowball. By the time we finished, we ended up with 3 volumes with a total of 60 stories, and something like over 1,000 pages. So it was by far the largest collection that had ever been put together. At the time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's former home, which is, as Peter mentioned, Undershaw. It's an amazing building. He had a hand in designing it. It was built around the turn of the century. It was under threat of being destroyed. So a group of fans had got together to try and protect the building, and we'd got involved with the Conan Doyle estate, so the family, to help promote that, and some famous writers, actors, Stephen Fry, Mark Gatiss, people like that got involved. We were part of the movement to get to the High Court to stop this beautiful building being destroyed, and part of British writing history, as Callum was mentioning. And if you fast forward to now, a wonderful school for children with learning disabilities called Stepping Stones, that is now their home. And the building has been beautifully restored back to its former glory. So the original building has been restored back, and another building put to the side of it. And we've continued to work with the school. After those first 3 volumes were produced, David got back in touch and said, got a bit of a problem. The stories keep coming in. So he'd asked for these stories to come in, and he said, I've got loads of writers from all over the world that missed out on the first 3. Would you mind doing just one more? You know, we'll do it for Conan Doyle's birthday, May 22nd. We'll call it an annual for, celebrate Conan Doyle's birthday. Just one more, Steve, just one more. I said, yeah, no problem. That's right, volume 4. And if you fast forward to this year, 5 years later, we are just about to publish on Conan Doyle's birthday, volume 25, volume 26, and volume 27. It is now we now have over 570 stories. We have more than 200 writers contributing, including Peter, several times over. More than 5 million words. If you order the collection now, you basically need a truck to deliver it, because this is one of the volumes. So if you imagine 27 like that, I don't even have a shelf strong enough to put them all on now. But it's just completely snowballed. We've had some really famous people taking part. Lee Child, who written the Jack Reacher stories, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Douglas Wilmot, many, David Stewart Davis, Lindsay Fay, Bonnie Mcbird. And it's just been a wonderful project. I think to date we've raised $85,000 for the school and funded a whole bunch of projects at the school. So funnily enough, we're all talking on Zoom today. Zoom is one of our sponsors. So I have to give them a shout out. So we have a complete Zoom room at the school to enable the kids and the teachers to communicate to the outside world, which we put in a few years ago, but it's proved very useful under the pandemic. So that's the collection. It just keeps going. And David edits every single one. So he's now officially, I think, the world's most prolific pastiche editor, having edited nearly 1,000 pastiches. And I think he's probably the most prolific pastiche writer, because he's written 80 himself. So I don't know where he finds the time. I work 7 days a week with this on the weekends, but David's even more of a Sherlockian workaholic than me.
You've I think touched upon it, but could you just share with us, that collaboration and friendship you've had with David? It seems very special. He's a little bit more reclusive in some ways. You remind me of kind of a Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak or Dave Packard, Bill Hewlett partnership. Do you have kind of complementary aspects of your personalities?
Yeah, I would say so. I guess, my day job is in technology and in sales management. So, standing in front of people and doing talks is kind of what I've got to do day in, day out. This is my, I think, 14th video call of the day today. So I'm used to doing this sort of stuff. So David is very much a prolific editor. I've had the pleasure of meeting David several times. He's done 3 what he calls pilgrimages to the UK to visit the UK and go around the different Conan Doyle locations. And most interesting thing about David is he's worn a deer stalker since his early 20s. He wears it absolutely everywhere he goes. So for those of you that's not familiar with what a deer stalker is, this is a deer stalker. So he basically can be seen out in his deer stalker absolutely everywhere. And you can find him on Facebook and on social media. He's worn that deer stalker all over the UK as well, on his pilgrimages as well. We were really pleased to bring him over for the launch of the Emecz Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories collection back in, I think, 2015. And he's been back twice since as well.
Wonderful. And you touched upon that you spend part of the year in Africa. You're involved in supporting nonprofits there. Could you speak just a little bit about what you support and what you're involved with there?
Yes, so Emecz started, as I said, sort of officially in 2006, and we never really intended for it to be much more than a bit of fun and a hobby. But sort of 15 years later and 500 books later, it's become an incredible vehicle for us to work on certain projects. So my wife and I have a number of passion projects. Undershore and Stepping Stones being one in the UK. I'm a patron of the school there. But one of our core projects is in Nairobi in Kenya. My wife took a sabbatical 9 years ago and spent a month in Africa, and ended up working with a project called Happy Life Children's Home. And Happy Life rescue abandoned babies in Nairobi. And up until about now, they've saved the lives of about 600 babies that had been abandoned. And until the pandemic came, Sharon and I have spent the last 7 Christmases and New Year's out with the kids in Nairobi. So we spend a couple of weeks out there. So when people usually ask me, do you have kids? I would normally answer 50 weeks of the year, I don't have any. And then for 2 weeks, I have about 120. So we would go out and spend time with the kids, and it's been a fantastic experience for us. We started with just simple volunteering, baby feeding, feeding 20 babies 3 times a day, and painting and all that sort of stuff. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've really been involved with a bit more strategic projects. So they've built a hospital there, a pediatric hospital. They've built now 3 schools. So the project has expanded exponentially over the last sort of 15 years. Interestingly, it was well before the pandemic, but I mentioned Zoom earlier. Zoom agreed to be a global sponsor of ours, and we actually Zoom enabled the different locations of Happy Life, which saved them tens of thousands of dollars in traveling time between the different locations. So that's Happy Life. The other project we're getting increasingly involved with is the United Nations World Food Programme. So I've been a technology mentor for them for the last 4 years, and with regular visits to Munich in Germany with their innovation team. So for those of you that don't know the World Food Programme, it's the world's largest NGO with a budget, I think, around $6 or $7 billion. And they're responsible for feeding approximately 120 million people a year who otherwise wouldn't have anything to eat. So it's a very big team. I think it's about 60,000 people. And I would regularly go to Munich every 2 or 3 times a year to get involved with helping with the technology program. And we were very proud that last year the program was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's terrific. my sister was sad she couldn't be on the call with us. She spent about 8 years in Nairobi with her 4 children and her husband, who flew for AIM Air. I'll ask a couple more questions, and then normally what I do in meetings is I'll have people tender their questions to the chat window and then posit those questions. But I think we're a small enough group today where we'll, in just a little bit, we'll open up the microphones and let people ask you questions directly, Steve, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's no problem at all.
Let's see here. I wanted to ask, you touched upon it earlier, the sort of the reinterpretations of the canon. The cool thing about your project with David Markham is that you've sort of had that be more in the style of the traditional canon. Do you want to speak to any of the controversies that you see in Sherlock fandom? I know some folks weary of the sort of the sociopathic personality of some modern television characters, but maybe you could speak to some of the controversies you've seen over the years, maybe Will Ferrell and the comic production of Sherlock Holmes, etc.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because if you talk to the very, very traditional Sherlock Holmes fans, by the way, I'll give you a little definition of the different types of Sherlock Holmes fans. You've got Sherlockians, who is the everyday fan of Sherlock Holmes. Above them in seriousness, you have the Holmesians, because if you know, back in Victorian times, nobody used first names, right? So it was Holmes and Watson. You would never use somebody's first name. You would always use their surname. So by definition, if you're a Sherlockian, you're already not serious enough to be a Holmesian, because you're using the name Sherlock, right? So you've got Sherlockians, you've got Holmesians, and at the very top of the tree, you have Doyleans. And they are the ones that are really serious about Conan Doyle's work and the canon. Interestingly, by definition, Emecz Publishing ourselves, we are, to the very serious Holmesians and Doyleans, we're quite naughty because we're publishing new stories. So to some very serious Sherlock Holmes fans, there will only ever be the 60 tales, because it can only be Conan Doyle, and it's kind of insulting to try and replicate what Conan Doyle did. But David's Emecz Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, interestingly, that's the most successful format for publishing Sherlock Holmes work. And if we look at our most successful book of all time, is by a writer called Richard Ryan. So it's this one here. It's called The Vatican Cameos, and it actually has an endorsement by Lee Child on it. So that is very, very traditional Sherlock Holmes pastiche, and Richard has got 6 or 7 of those. Most successful type, but we do lots of different types of Sherlock Holmes stories and non-fiction books as well. So we're kind of in that naughty category. So this is an advent calendar for Sherlock Holmes. It's got a mystery on one side, and if you turn it over on the other side, it's got a solution. One a day for December. Bit of fun, but most Sherlockians will see that as a bit of fun. The very serious guys, not so much. And then it goes to the fact that we even launched a new brand last year called Orange Pip Books, because for the very serious fans, they wanted to make sure that they were picking up a book. If they pick up an Orange Pip book, they know it's not going to be traditional. And this is a really interesting one. We published it this year. To our knowledge, it's the first Sherlock Holmes pastiche where the major character suffers from a disability. So we're trying to make with Orange Pip a lot more inclusive. So we have a lot of LGBTQ and BAME characters, which simply didn't appear in the canon, because in the Victorian era, there were no characters, very few female characters, very few very few disabled characters, etc. So it depends on who you talk to about what is acceptable. What's interesting in the fandom is it explodes every time there's a new adaptation and people take positions. And of course, with social media now, people can express their opinions very loudly via Twitter and Facebook, etc. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of them is that there's been a recent Netflix film called Enola Holmes. So this actually features a young lady who's the daughter of Sherlock Holmes in the story, and she is all the character is all about her. So when they release this, you know, it's appealing to a new generation, right? Which is all great, and we support all formats of Sherlock Holmes. What was interesting was the fandom got really, really annoyed about one particular thing about the Enola Holmes film, which was that Sherlock Holmes was too good looking. So it's played by a character called Henry Cavill, and that was it. All social media exploded over the fact that he's just way too good looking. So very chiseled and very handsome, and that's not Sherlock Holmes. You know, Sherlock Holmes isn't chiseled and handsome. He's a, you know, he has to be tall. That's the other thing that was very interesting. If you look at the Robert Downey Jr. movies, again, steampunk and lots of explosions and all the other bits and pieces. What did people get annoyed about? Robert Downey Jr. He's too short because he was shorter than Watson. And in again, go back to your Paget illustrations, Glenn, you'll see that Holmes is always taller than Watson, I think, in all of the illustrations. And in almost every adaptation in history, Holmes has been taller than Watson. But along comes the Robert Downey Jr. movies, and he's very short. He's only, I think, 5'7" or 5'8", and they cast him alongside Jude Law. So, you know, there's lots of things to get annoyed about. What did they get annoyed about? The actor's a bit too short. Really fascinating.
One of the things that I do in some of the pastiches I've written is I sneak in a little bit of morality subtly, but where, for example, in Victorian times, chocolatiers would extend the chocolate by introducing brick dust, but they also would introduce, I think it was mercury or lead, and therefore cause great harm. And so I sneak in a little bit of Sherlock Holmes dealing with that scourge. Another thing that happened during the Victorian times was the manufacturing of matches. The phosphorus, that particular type, was very toxic, and it would eat through the cheeks of the young children and women working in the match factories. I think some of which were run by Quakers, ironically. So I have Sherlock Holmes sort of weighing in and being a part of that change, but I just do it very lightly because I don't want to, you know, be heavy-handed. So I appreciate you talking about both nuances, but also, you know, taking on more bold adaptations. Why don't I do this? Why don't we open up the microphones, and for those of you who have some questions regarding what Steve Emecz does, a little bit about pastiches, the original canon. I noticed Mike had a correction on one of the characters, so why don't we open up the microphones and Glenn, I know you've given a talk, a number of talks. One was at the Book Club of California. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask Steve or observations that you'd like to share with us? Oh, and you'll have to unmute yourself.
I'm particularly curious if you found any geographic region, US, Japan, whatever, that's particularly great consumer of these pastiches.
That's a really good question, Glenn. So we've licensed our books to other regions. The most successful one for us has been, interestingly, Italy. So in Italy, they have a publisher called Mondadori, and Mondadori has a 90-year history of producing what they call the Yellow Book. Every month, they produce one mystery, and it will be from all the biggest writers in the world, one mystery in bright yellow, and it sells out every month. They do one a month, and they've been doing it for 90 years. 5 years ago, they tested an idea that Sherlock Holmes was so popular at the time with all the different adaptations. Could we also launch a Sherlock Holmes novel every month? And they thought they could do it for 12 months. 5 years later, it's still going. And this is what they look like. This is one of the Mondadori. So it's Igiallo Mondadori. So it's the Yellow Book of Sherlock Holmes. And we've now supplied more than 50 novels into this series in Italy, and every single one sells out. So they just do one print run, put it out there, and every month they all sell out. The other area that this was massively popular for us a few years ago, we licensed 15 titles into Russia. This is a Russian edition. Really unusual format, actually. It's kind of like a hardcover, but very, very thin paper. So we did 15 books out there. These sold in their tens of thousands. I mean, they're absolutely massive sales there. We're trying to get a bit more involved in Asia. So we're trying to do some licensing into Asia. Sherlock Holmes is massive in Japan.
Oh yeah, I don't know if you know this, but the largest Sherlock Holmes Society on the planet is the Sherlock Holmes Society of Tokyo. And they're larger by like a factor of 10. I mean, it's not like they're twice as large as the next one.
Yeah. So we've done one book into Japanese, which is actually, we've done two. So we've done an extract from the Emecz book of New Sherlock Holmes stories in Japanese. And we also we've done 3 biographies of Benedict Cumberbatch, performance biographies of Benedict Cumberbatch. And the first one of those was done into Japanese as well. The other thing that we find is really interesting is there's huge followings, not just for Sherlock Holmes as a character, but also a particular adaptation or a particular actor. So this year we produced our largest ever book, and it's proven to be one of our best-selling books ever, which is this one, which is Jeremy Brett playing a part. So this is a biography of everything he was ever in. But we got such a massive response from the Jeremy Brett fan base to do an extract from this of just the Sherlock stuff. So we had to produce a second book within a few months called Jeremy Brett is Sherlock Holmes, just to have the Sherlock element as well there. But yeah, Sherlock Holmes fans, millions in each country, I think.
I just wondered if there were any particular bright spots. In a way, Italy doesn't surprise me. When you come to New York, you'll find that the group that's the subgroup that's the most fun are the folks that show up from Italy.
Yeah, so the US is probably 80% of the books we sell are in the US. And one interesting characteristic about the US market is every year we get a few fans contacting us who truly believe that Sherlock Holmes was real. so that he wasn't a creation of Conan Doyle, where he was actually a real person. So sometimes when we do cheeky adaptations, because if you read most pastiches, they always start at the beginning with a traditional, I've reached into the old tin box to get a story, or I found this manuscript, or I did this, or I did that. And sometimes we get contacted by fans who want to buy the original case notes, for example. So the case notes from the Hound of the Baskervilles, we did a book which mocked up the original case notes. Now, of course, it's fiction, but we had people contacting us saying they wanted to buy the original case files from the original police case files.
We have a question from Mike Ranieri.
Hi, Steve, it's great interview. I'm the president of the Toronto Bootmakers Sherlock Holmes Society. You've done I mean, all the stories, the pastiches, it's just overwhelming how many of them are. And you've published so many good ones and whatever. If somebody was going to, from your experience, wanted to write a pastiche, what advice would you give them? I mean, almost everything has been done. Sherlock Holmes' sister, his daughter, his son, Sherlock Holmes in the future, Sherlock Holmes in the, in different ethnicities, different characters. What would you advise people about these different pastiches, and what are you looking for new stories from new authors?
That's a really good question. So, and I know several of your members very well. So, Mark Alberstadt and a number of others. So, firstly, I'm going to slightly disagree. It hasn't all been done, because when you think it's all been done, suddenly you get something. So, Tracy Revels, who has recently been invested in the BSI this year, she teaches a Sherlock Holmes class, which I think is really cool. So she managed to get Sherlock Holmes onto the curriculum as a teacher. She approached us with a book called Shadowfall. And when I first read it, it absolutely fascinating. Sherlock Holmes is a warlock. So if you think, with werewolves and warlocks and stuff like that, and she went on to write two more, Shadow Blood and Shadow Wraith. And I think time travel, we have authors writing about Sherlock Holmes meeting the characters from Alice in Wonderland. We have an incredible series written by Harry DeMeo, and we're just about to publish book 15 in the series, called the Octavius Bear series. And the concept there is an alternative universe where humans have disappeared and been replaced by sentient animals, right? So no humans anymore, but there's meerkats and bears and whatever walking around having conversations. And Sherlock Holmes is a 9-foot tall bear called Octavius. And it's a fantastic series. Open and Shut Case is the first book, but he's created an entire universe where all the kind of characters that you would recognize from the Sherlock Holmes stories are sentient animals that have adventures. So the advice I'd give anybody is, first off, don't do it to make money. It's a niche. It's very much a niche within crime fiction. If you want to write to make money, do modern crime fiction, because that's incredibly popular. But I would say, if decide where you want to start, whether you want to write traditional or whether you want to do something different, because there is for me, it's really quite black and white in terms of the fan base. The fan base for traditional pastiche is quite large, and for adaptations and changes to that's a lot tougher to sell. or a lot tougher to get a big fan base to adopt. If you're going to go traditional, it will Holmes and Watson in the era. So keep them within that era of the late 1880s through to the 1920s, 1930s. There's quite a lot. We're getting quite a lot of pastiches coming in where Holmes is older because they want to go later on. Yeah, they want to go in Second World War or whatever. You know, Holmes is in his 70s or 80s by then. So
well, now that the copyrights for the later stories is going, that's a possibility.
Yeah. So I think also depends how serious you want to be. So one of the most successful pastiche writers around at the moment is a lady called Bonnie Mcbird.
Yeah.
And Bonnie's done four books. Her latest one has just been released, but Art in the Blood was
three locks.
3 locks, yeah. And I've got my copy ready to read next time I get a few days off.
Well, you'll find that I'm in it.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. I'll look out for you, Glenn. So what's interesting about Bonnie is, and she writes for, I think it's Random House that she writes for. And what Bonnie does is Bonnie actually studied Conan Doyle's cadence of his sentence construction. So she doesn't just write in the era, in the style of Conan Doyle with the characters, but she actually constructs her sentences in the same way Conan Doyle. She goes to that level of writing specificity. But I think the best advice I can give anybody is just have some fun with it.
Would you suggest novel length or short stories?
Ooh, that's a tough one because Conan Doyle didn't actually write any novel length. So the longest story Conan Doyle did was Hound of the Baskervilles, and Hound of the Baskervilles is about half the length of a modern novel. So if you think a modern novel rocks in at about 80, 90,000 words, I think, and Glenn will probably correct me here because it's about 45, 48,000 on Hound of the Baskervilles, something of that ilk. And you've got to bear in mind, he wrote in the Victorian era, right? So, you know, people's propensity to read and read at length. That's why the majority of what he wrote was short stories and published in the Strand. So short stories are quite hard to write. I think short story pastiches are harder than novels, to be honest. But that's very split. I have pastiche writers who can knock out a short story very quickly and a very good one, but struggle with the longer format with the novels. Very interesting interview, if you can get hold of it. Roger Johnson interviewed Anthony Horowitz when he brought out The House of Silk. And I was very privileged to be in the audience listening to the interview live at the British Library. And Horowitz talked about how scared he was about writing that book, because he said, you know, the publishers wanted 90,000 words so that they could sell it as a proper paperback, hardback out in the market. But he found that everything he'd read of Conan Doyle's was half the length. So he actually wrote 2 books. So the way he created House of Silk is he actually wrote 2 independent books and then weaved them together. To make it work.
Steve, just before I let you go, the bootmakers do regular meetings now or on Zoom, but I'm very much open to or want to promote new writers and writers' books and stuff, and I'd love to be able to email you and see if I can get some of your writers and stuff to come and do some talks and promote their books to the bootmakers.
Oh, that'd be absolutely wonderful. We've been trying to bring some cheer to the pandemic world by doing events as well. We've done some Sherlock Holmes theatre under the lockdown. On our website, by the way, you can watch all of these. All the videos are there. And about a month ago, we did an event as a tribute to Jeremy Brett. And we had 400 and I think it's 406 Sherlock Holmes fans from around the world registered for the event on Zoom. It was chaotic. We actually had about 300 people. Obviously, we couldn't do this format. We did panelists and then an audience. But we opened up for anybody with questions, put them in the chat window. And it was literally like a ticker tape.
Yeah.
The questions were coming in, whizzing through from these fans. I think 17, 18 countries around the world, South Korea to Brazil was represented. So it's great. And we'd love to do that. And it would be great if, do you open it out to fans from around the world? Or?
Oh yeah, now that we're on Zoom, you know, we have people all over the place. We've had from London, we had Matthew Bostrom, Matthias Bostrom. We've had everybody, you know, we've got some Japanese bootmakers, and they've given presentations. So we're open to a lot of things, and not just, like, I try to keep it open to not just Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle, but even the wider mystery and detective fiction as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. Peter was mentioning about David Markham. One of the things that we're really supportive of is David is trying to bring back into print some of the other detectives from that era that are now very, very hard to get hold of. So one of the projects we're quite proud of, took us nearly 3 years to get it done, but we actually released the entire Thorndike collection by Freeman. So many of those stories were very, very difficult to get hold of, and David managed to get hold of the entire collection and painstakingly reformatted them into 9 volumes. They make these look small, so the Thorndike ones just are like, you know, 700 pages, really pushing the edge of print on demand. Yeah, it would be great to get some.
Well, we have, like, that's great, because, you know, often we have new members, younger members who just focused on either the films or the TV show and don't really know the larger mystery detective environment. And I'd love to, like, get someone to talk about Thorndike or talk about the other detectives, and you know, expose that to our group. So yeah, you know, Mark Alberstadt, so maybe I'll go through him to you, and maybe we can work out some guest speakers for future meetings.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
Thank you, Mike. Let me tease out a few questions or comments. How about Diane Craddock, from your experience teaching? How has literature impacted, you know, the imagination and love of learning of your students over the years?
Well, my teaching was mostly in the sciences, so science and math, but I grew up with an English literature father and spent most of my life reading and dealing with literature. And so we always added it to our science classes, and went through a lot of the natural history writers. And so I think it enriched my teaching with science, but you know, I think it's super important nowadays for students to see this type of literature, and to know that it's so inspiring to see this pastiche genre going out there, that they can really create so much of this. So I'm very, very happy about it. I really enjoyed it, and dug out my parents' Conan Doyle books and saw lots of pictures of Basil Rathbone cut out and stuck within the volume from 1930s, because my mother was a real Basil Rathbone fan. So, but thank you for inviting me. It's been great, really great. Thanks.
A pleasure, Diane. Chris, you want to weigh in with a comment or two before you sign off? We love your background there.
Well, I had to put something up, didn't I? I just have to say, Callum, as a Brummie, I completely understand what you mean about accents. Fortunately, my mother made me lose my Birmingham accent very, very early on in age. No, I just, obviously, I've loved the genre all my life. I grew up with Sherlock as something I read and read and read. And the pastiche idea is just such brilliance. And I am amazed how people manage to find the new stories. The question about that to me was astonishing, but I am a traditionalist, I have to say. I do love the more traditional stories. Yes, the movies are fun, the TV story, series are fun, but let's stick to the traditional Sherlock idea. That's to me the greatest piece. But just a wonderful way to spend an hour. So I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for the invitation, Peter.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Chris. How about Mark Rollins? I don't know if you can unmute your microphone. You might be out on a tractor for all I know. He may be unavailable, but Mark is a wonderful actor and has done some great plays that I've had the privilege of watching. Neil, do you have any thoughts as a retired? Well, I won't say what you used to do, but as a writer in retirement.
Well, you can call me a retired intelligence officer if you want.
Okay.
It happens to be true. And I'm now a failed writer. So,
well, I wouldn't say failed. I would say perfecting.
well, thanks for inviting me. This is fascinating to see this. And it's interesting to see Diane Craddock, who has a connection through a friend of ours, Geordie Post, and Frenzy. So someone who is a great writer and recently died. So that's all I've got to say right now. Maybe next time I've got more to think about, but I'm not even at the category of being a Sherlockian.
Well, it's nice to have you join us. Richard Blish, a brilliant mind, so curious, and over 100 patents to your name. Any thoughts or comments?
Actually, the comments about seeing the case notes brought up something kind of interesting. Many years ago, I read a book where some scholar compared Jack London's notes to his novels. They were identical.
Well,
Your Swiss stuff, do you want to mention that?
Oh, yeah, Marion and I did visit Meiringen, Switzerland, where Sherlock Holmes supposedly died. And we got some nice pictures of the bronze statue that is roughly life-size, that you can sit down beside Sherlock. Yeah, so this is.
Near the Reichenbach Falls.
Reichenbach Falls, yes.
wonderful. And how about Steve Lopes? You with Steve Emecz probably get the furthest traveled via Zoom today, coming in from the U.S. Virgin Islands. Steve, is that correct?
Close enough. Dr. St. Martin.
Okay.
I barely qualify as a Sherlockian. I've just enjoyed the hour, and thanks so much for the invitation, Peter. It was great to hear you, Steve.
Thank you.
Pleasure. And David, do you want to make any comments before we sign off? And how about Aman or Abhijit?
Hey, Peter, Abhijit, yeah, thanks for inviting. It's been a pleasure listening. I grew up with the stories. I've always felt that reading gave me the opportunity to imagine the Sherlock world on my own terms, so that was much more enjoyable than seeing something in a TV or a movie. But I really enjoyed those books, and it was like a pilgrimage. I lived and worked in London for a little while. It was almost like a pilgrimage to go to 221B Baker Street and see that bus. You know, the whole underground station is filled with images and silhouettes of Sherlock. So I've been enjoying listening to all of you eminent speakers, writers, actors talk. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Peter.
Well, we're glad you're here. And how about 707? You want to chime in before we sign off? You're calling in?
Just enjoyed it. It was very fun. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Well, I think we'll call our meeting to a close. Steve, you're getting ready to put on your night stockings and have a cup of hot cocoa or brandy. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it'll be hot milk and cinnamon is the order of the day during the week. And I just wanted to, just before we wrap up, mention just two very unusual sort of projects and adaptations, just to get your minds thinking. Somebody mentioned earlier about, is it harder to write a short story or a novel? There's actually one format that we do at the moment, which I think is the hardest to write, which is a project called Dear Holmes. And Dear Holmes is an American subscription service where every month mystery fans get a letter through the regular mail, through the USPS, and it's a letter written to Sherlock Holmes with clues about a case and a story. It's essentially a short form pastiche broken into 4 letters and a 5th letter, which is a solution. So for mystery fans, they get to read the story every week and try and solve the case before Holmes can solve the case. So in theory, you should be able to solve the case if you're really good at it by the 3rd letter, but by the 4th letter, most amateur detectives will have solved the case. I think that's probably the hardest pastiche format to write, because you've got to reverse engineer a pastiche back into 4 letters and have the right balance of clues amongst it. So that's one. And the other one, for just for Glenn maybe to find it interesting, is we have a project called The Art of Sherlock Holmes. And this is where Phil Growick, who's one of our authors, he's lives in Palm Beach in Florida. He has combined pastiches with artists, and we have created 55 pieces of art. And you can come to our website and actually walk around the gallery and look at these different pieces of art. And I'm going to show you a couple of them now. This is from the second book. This is called The Woman Returns. And it is an amazing artist called Christina Major. And she has actually merged the faces of 3 different actresses into a picture. This is just a recreation of it. The actual original is 10 times the size of this. We have this one here by an artist called Tracy Guiteau, and hidden inside the original painting, which was exhibited at the Anne Norton Sculpture Gardens 2 years ago, hidden in the picture are the clues to the mystery and the pastiche that she based it upon. And all of the art is captured in these books. So what we do in the book is have the pastiche with the piece of art alongside each other inside the book. So lots of different formats, lots of different things. But those are I think it's going to keep evolving over the coming years.
And Steve,
Peter,
if you don't mind, would you type in your website, and you can also say it verbally if you would.
Yeah, it's just mxpublishing.com. So it's M for mother, X for xylophone, publishing.com. I'll put it in the chat, but I'll
Peter?
also.
Yes,
There we go.
Glenn.
I was going to say, would you mind if I read a paragraph from one of Arthur Conan Doyle's speeches? This is about the comment earlier about how these stories, these mysteries, are difficult to put together.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Please feel at liberty to do that.
So this is an excerpt. Conan Doyle gave a much longer speech for the Authors Club in 1896 in London. He titled the speech "The Work of Literature." Anyway, here he says, and then the chairman has alluded to another class of work which I have attempted, namely the Sherlock Holmes stories. I have been much blamed for doing that gentleman to death, but I hold that it was not murder, but justified homicide in self-defense, since if I had not killed him, he certainly would have killed me. For a man who has no particular natural astuteness to spend his days in inventing problems and building up chains of inductive reasoning is a trying occupation.
Bravo. And we luckily, thanks to Steve, we don't have to walk around with black armbands because the stories keep coming. Steve, on behalf of all of us and, across the pond and elsewhere, thanks for taking time out of your busy day and into your evening hours to, just bring such wonderful information to us as Sherlock Holmes fans. And thanks for carrying on the torch.
It's an absolute pleasure. I never thought 13 years ago with that first book from Alastair that we'd be here, with 500 books later and just, 2 or 3, 4 books a month coming out. So the fans want more stories. I think it's the most enduring character. I think it holds the Guinness World Record for the most portrayed character on screen now. So I think it will go on. Sherlock Holmes will probably go on forever.
Well, thank you again. And thanks also to Callum Cunningham for taking time out of your workday to help be a backup in case we lost power up in the hills here.
That was a pleasure. I loved it. It was great. Thanks, Steve.
Well, please stay tuned. We'll have some other events coming up in June. I'm going to try to do a live event where we're going to meet at hopefully Coyote Sporting Clays in Morgan Hill, where we'll be toting 12 gauge shotguns and shooting at clay pigeons. I hope to have some young superstars as guest speakers who are U.S. Olympian candidates or junior Olympians or collegiate superstars. So we'll have proceeds from that event, hopefully going to U.S. shooting to support the U.S. shooting team, Olympic shooting team. With that, I wish you all a wonderful day, and we'll bring the meeting to a close. And thanks again.
Thank you ever so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.